All right, hello and welcome to this training. As you can see from the title, what we're going to be covering today is your brain's God mode and how to turn it on. And as you can see from the overview, what we're going to be talking about more specifically is first the overview itself, the default mode you've been stuck in your whole life, what God mode actually is and why almost nobody accesses it, the activation protocol, the review, and finally your action items for the day or the next few days. Now, before we get started, if you want to work with me one-on-one, then make sure to book a call from the link in the description. If you want this document along with this training, then make sure to join the free community from the link in the description. And if you want weekly emails on how to improve in your health, wealth, love, and self, all these 4 areas of your life, then make sure to join the newsletter from the link in the description. Without further ado, let's get started and talk about the default mode you've been stuck in your whole life. So there's this thing your brain does every single day, all day, completely without your permission. And it's basically running your entire life on a setting you never really chose. And it's a setting that was installed before you were even old enough to spell your own name. And the craziest part is you've probably never even noticed it because it feels so normal that you just assume that's how thinking works. Now, before I show you how to switch it off, I need you to understand what it actually is, because if you skip this part and you just jump to the how, it won't really stick. And I'd rather give you something that genuinely changes the way you operate rather than just another technique that sounds cool for a week and then fades out. So here's the thing. Your brain has what neuroscientists literally call a default mode network, which is this baseline operating state it drops into whenever you're not actively engaged in something demanding. And in that state, your mind is just wandering, recycling old thoughts, replaying conversations, worrying about stuff that hasn't even happened, running simulations of worst case scenarios, and it feels like you're actually thinking, but it's really just looping nonsense. It's overthinking to a degree. And what makes that so tricky is that most people spend somewhere between 50 and 70% of their waking hours in this default state, which means for the majority of your day, you're basically on autopilot, reacting to whatever pops up in your environment or your inbox instead of deliberately choosing where your attention goes. And over time, that becomes your entire experience of life, scattered, reactive, always slightly behind. Now, the real cost of this isn't just that you're unfocused, it's that default mode is actually training your cognitive energy on things that produce 0 results. So by the time you sit down to do the thing that actually matters, your brain has already spent most of its fuel on basically nonsense and phantom problems that don't really even exist yet. Now, the reason most people never fix this is because it's invisible. Like, you can't see your own default mode the same way a fish can't really see water, right? It's just the medium you exist in, which is why so many people go their whole lives feeling busy and tired and quote unquote productive without ever actually operating at the level their brain is really capable of. Now, your default mode isn't random. It was shaped by basically everything you absorbed growing up, the way your parents handled stress, the emotional climate of your household, what your teachers rewarded and punished, and all of that basically got baked into your nervous system as a kind of baseline operating frequency that your brain now treats as normal, even though it's wildly inefficient. So you can think of it like a thermostat in a way. Once again, your brain has a set point for how much focus, output, and clarity it allows you to have before it starts pulling you back to the default. And you've probably felt this if you've ever had an incredibly productive day, and then the next day you felt completely drained or unmotivated for no apparent reason. That's basically the thermostat doing its job. It's keeping you in range. It's keeping you in your default mode of productivity and achievement and so on. And you can even think of this in a way as upper limiting, which is something we've talked about on this channel before. Now, what most people experience as their limit or their capacity isn't actually a limit at all. It's just the ceiling set by their default programming, which means the question isn't whether your brain can do more, because it absolutely can. The question is whether you know how to override the default setting and then access what's underneath it, which is exactly what we're about to get into. So if you're being honest with yourself, you probably recognize a lot of this in your own life, that feeling of basically spinning your wheels, doing a lot, but accomplishing weirdly little. And what I want to show you next is what's on the other side of that default, because your brain has a completely different mode it can operate in. And when you learn how to access it, everything changes. Now that you understand the default, let's talk about what God mode actually is. Let's talk about the upgrade, because your brain genuinely has a higher operating state that most people only stumble into by accident a few times in their life, and when they actually do, they describe it as being in the zone or being in flow, or that one week where everything just clicked, but they never really learn how to trigger it on purpose, which is basically like owning a supercar and only driving it in first gear. So what I'm calling God mode is really the convergence of three things happening simultaneously. Deep focus, where your attention is basically locked on a single target with zero leakage. Cognitive clarity, where your thinking feels sharp and layered and fast, almost effortlessly. And what I'd call identity alignment, where the thing you're doing and the person you believe yourself to be are completely in sync. So there's no internal friction, no self-doubt, no part of you pulling in a different direction. Now, this isn't some abstract concept I'm making up, because Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, the psychologist who basically built the science around flow states, described it as a state where the challenge of the task and your skill level are perfectly matched, and in that state, self-consciousness disappears. Time distortion kicks in as well, and your performance spikes dramatically. And if you've ever experienced it even once, and you probably have, you know exactly what I'm talking about. That feeling where 3 hours pass and it feels like 20 minutes, and you produce more in that window than you normally do in a full day, and sometimes even in a full week. And what's actually happening in your brain during this state is a cocktail of neurochemicals, dopamine, norepinephrine, endorphins, anandamide, all firing together in a way that dramatically increases pattern recognition, creative problem solving, and sustained attention. So it's not just that you feel better, your brain is literally operating on a different level. It's a different chemistry than it does in default mode, which is why the output quality is also so much higher. Now, there's also some research from McKinsey showing that executives in flow states were up to 500% more productive, which sounds insane until you experience it yourself, and you probably have, and realize that, yeah, when everything clicks like that, you really can do a week's worth of work in a single afternoon. And the difference isn't really effort, it's state. But the problem is most people experience this maybe a handful of times a year, maybe a handful of times a month, totally by accident, usually because the conditions just happen to align, and then they spend the rest of their time in default mode wondering why they can't get back to that level. So then the obvious question is, if this state exists and it's this powerful, why isn't everyone accessing it all the time? And the answer comes back down to what we talked about in the first section, your default programming, because your nervous system has a comfort zone, and accessing God mode means pushing past it, which triggers resistance. And that resistance shows up as procrastination, distraction, self-doubt, fatigue, basically every productivity problem you've ever had. The wild part is your brain thinks it's protecting you, because from an evolutionary standpoint, burning that much cognitive fuel or energy in a sustained way was risky. Your ancestors needed to conserve energy for survival, not spend it. So your default mode is essentially an energy conservation program that made perfect sense 10,000 years ago, but is now actively holding you back in a world where your survival really depends on creative output and strategic thinking and productivity. And so the whole game, the actual skill that separates people who operate at an elite level from people who just think about it, is really learning how to consciously override that default protection mechanism and deliberately place yourself in the conditions where God mode actually activates. And that's the protocol I'm about to walk you through step by step. And look, some people will hear all of this and go figure it out on their own, and that's great. But if you're someone who wants to collapse the timeline and make the shift happen now, I work with a small number of people one-on-one to do exactly that. And you can book a free call with me using the link in the description below. And even if you're not sure whether it's the right fit, the call itself will most likely give you more clarity in 30 minutes than most people get in years of trying to figure it out alone. So allow yourself to take that step, and at a minimum, you'll walk away knowing exactly what's been keeping you stuck. So with that said, the activation protocol. So now you understand the default, you understand what God mode actually is and why your brain resists it. Now I want to give you the exact protocol I use to activate it consistently, not by accident once a month, but on purpose, basically whenever I need it. And I want to be clear that this isn't complicated. It's actually pretty simple once you see the pieces. The hard part is just doing it consistently enough that it becomes your new normal. So the very first piece, and honestly the one people underestimate the most, is your physical environment, because your brain is constantly scanning your surroundings for signals about what mode to operate in. And if your environment is cluttered or chaotic or full of potential distractions, well, your nervous system reads that as stay alert, stay in default, don't go deep. So before you even think about focus techniques or mindset work, you really need to design a space that tells your brain it's safe to lock in. Now look, I've talked about this multiple times on this channel, and it always bears repeating because most people are trying to work in environments that are really made for, well, not for work for sure. And this means elimination before optimization. So instead of adding tools and apps and systems, you strip away everything that could pull your attention. And this means elimination before optimization. So instead of adding tools and apps and systems, you strip away everything that could pull your attention. Meaning your phone is in another room, not silenced in the same room, in another room, physically gone, and even turned off. Notifications off on your computer, door closed, and ideally the same physical space every time, so your brain starts to associate that environment with deep work the way it associates your bed with sleep. Now, over time, that environment becomes a trigger in itself, like Pavlov's bell for your focus, where just sitting down in that specific spot starts to shift your brain chemistry towards the state you want, which means the activation gets faster and easier the more consistently you use the same setup. And you can amplify this with sensory cues, same music or ambient sound every session, same drink, even the same time of day, because each of those consistent sensory inputs becomes another signal to your nervous system that says, okay, we're going deep now. And the more signals you stack, the faster the switch really happens. Now, the second part of environment is what I call the runway, which is the 5 to 10 minutes right before you actually start working, where you deliberately transition out of default mode and into working mode, right? And this can look like a short breathing exercise, a quick journaling dump to basically empty your mind of whatever's floating around, or even just sitting in silence with your eyes closed and mentally rehearsing what you're about to do. And the point is, you're giving your brain a clear signal that the context is shifting or has shifted and it's time to operate differently. Now, during that runway, one of the most powerful things you can actually do is set a single clear intention for the session, just one specific outcome you're actually going to produce, because clarity of intention is one of the strongest triggers for flow. Like, your brain needs to know exactly what it's aiming at and what it's about to do. And the more precise you make that target, the easier it is for you to focus on and to lock on. Now, what's important here is to also make sure you know when it ends, right? You need to know what done means as well in advance. And I'd honestly treat this runway as non-negotiable, the same way you'd warm up before a heavy lift, because skipping it and trying to go straight from checking your phone into deep work is really like trying to sprint from a dead stop. Your brain needs the transition to shift gears properly. Now, once you're in the environment and you've gone through the runway, the next piece is how you actually work during the session. And the core principle here is sustained single focus, meaning you pick one thing and you stay on it without switching for a minimum of 60 to 90 minutes, because the neurochemistry we talked about earlier takes a bit of time to build up. And if you break focus at the 30-minute mark to check something real quick, you basically reset the whole process and now have to really start over. Ideally, you stay single target because split attention leaks dopamine. But if you're in the worst case scenario and your brain is really fighting you hard, you can borrow a dual tasking trick from ADHD research by pairing the work with a simple, repeatable second stimulus that keeps the restless part of your attention busy without actually changing the main task. It could be walking on a treadmill, chewing gum, squeezing a stress ball, or using some steady background sound. A lot of you already most likely work with sound in the background, so doing the same sound every time can help as well. Now, there's another variation here where you switch between two projects or tasks at equal intervals, meaning you work on one for a set block of time, say 60 minutes, and then you shift fully to the other for the same amount of time and keep alternating. So your brain always has a fresh target to lock onto, and that restless novelty-seeking part of you remains fed without you ever actually multitasking or losing the depth of focus you're building, because it's the same two tasks. Now, here's where you'll most likely feel the pull of your default mode the strongest. Somewhere around 15 to 25 minutes in, there's going to be this wave of restlessness and a sudden need to check your phone or remember something you forgot to do. And I would even time it if I were you. And that feeling, that uncomfortable itch, is actually the signal that your brain is right on the edge of shifting into deeper state. Now, what I personally used to do is put a stopwatch on my watch and basically look for when that need to distract myself, when that default mode is actively trying to distract me. And basically, I did that over the course of a week. And I know it's somewhere between 15 to 25 minutes, at least for me. Now, I would recommend you setting up a stopwatch, call it a distraction stopwatch or something of that sort, and basically just time for how long you can work without actually having the need to distract yourself or to check your phone. And the worst thing you can do is give in at that moment, because you're essentially quitting right before the breakthrough. And you can think of it like a threshold you have to push through. And on the other side of that discomfort is really where everything opens up, where your thinking gets sharper and time starts to really bend and ideas come faster than you can write them down. And once you've crossed that threshold a few times consciously, you'll start to recognize the feeling and trust the process. Now, what you need to do in that moment is really surprisingly simple. You just notice the resistance, acknowledge it, like, yeah, that's the default mode trying to pull me back. And then you bring your attention back to the task. And each time you do, you're literally strengthening the neural pathways that support sustained focus. So even the failed attempts where you feel like you kept getting distracted are actually training your brain to hold the state for longer next time. Now, once you've gone through the full 60 to 90 minute block, you take a real break. And I'm not talking about scroll on your phone kind of break. I'm talking about an actual physical reset where you walk around, maybe drink some water, look out the window, let your brain decompress. You can even step out and actually have a real walk outside, and then you can go back in for another round. And most people find that they can do 2 to 4 of these deep work blocks per day before their cognitive reserves are genuinely spent, which doesn't sound like a lot until you realize that 2 to 4 hours of actual God mode focused output is worth more than most people produce in an entire week of default mode work. And this is the real mindset shift, because we've been trained to measure productivity by hours spent at a desk. But the truth is that 3 hours of deep focused single target work produces more value and more results than 10 hours of scattered multitasking. And once you experience that firsthand, it really completely changes your relationship with time and effort. And the beautiful thing is, it compounds. Because each day you practice this, your brain gets better at entering the state. You cross the threshold faster, you hold it for longer, and the output quality keeps climbing. So after a month or two of consistent practice, you're operating at a level that genuinely feels unfair compared to where you were before, and people around you will start to notice. Now, the last piece, the one that ties everything together and makes it permanent, in my opinion, is the identity layer. Because you can have the perfect environment and the perfect protocol and still fall off after a few weeks if your self-image doesn't match the level you're operating at. And like we talked about earlier with the thermostat idea, your subconscious will always pull you back to whoever it thinks you are. So the idea here is to really start identifying as someone who operates this way by default, someone who goes deep, who protects their focus, who doesn't give in to distractions. And you reinforce that identity through the daily repetition of actually showing up and doing the protocol, because every time you really sit down and push through into God mode, you're sending a signal to your subconscious that says, this is who I am now. And your brain will start to collect evidence for this new identity the same way it collected evidence for the old one, noticing the output, the results, the way that your days feel different. And over time, the new operating mode stops feeling like something you have to really activate and work to get to, and starts feeling like just how you work, which is really just the whole point. And that's when the change becomes permanent, when you've done it enough times that your thermostat really recalibrates upward and the new level becomes your default, and what used to be God mode just becomes mode. And from there, from that baseline, you can push even further into states most people don't even know are available to them. And so to bring it all together, this isn't about one good day or one good week. It's about installing a fundamentally different way of using your brain, one that's been available to you your entire life but was buried under layers of default programming and protective mechanisms that you didn't even know were running. And now that you can see them, you can really change them. Now, the state is always there, it's always available, and it's always been there. You've just never been taught how to reach it on purpose, and now you have the exact protocol to do that, which, in my opinion, puts you ahead of 99% of people who will spend their entire lives in default mode, thinking that's all there is, but only if you actually implement it. And at the end of the day, that's what it really comes down to, a choice you make every morning about which mode you're going to operate in. Now that you know both options exist, well, the only question is which one you're going to choose. With that said, let's cover the review. We talked about the overview. We talked about the default mode you've been stuck in your whole life, what God mode actually is and why almost nobody accesses it, the activation protocol, the review, and finally, your action items for the day or the next few days. First, set up your God mode environment this week by choosing one physical space, eliminating every distraction from it, and committing to using only that space for your deep work sessions. Tomorrow morning, run the full protocol once, 5 to 10 minute runway, set one clear intention, and then lock in for 60 to 90 minutes of single focus work without touching your phone. For the next 30 days, do at least one full God mode session per day and track what you produce, because the evidence you collect in that month will permanently rewire your belief about what you're actually capable of. Now, with that said, I hope this training brought a lot of value. If you want to work with me one-on-one, then make sure to book a call from the link in the description. Once again, if you want this document along with this training, then make sure to join the free community from the link in the description. And finally, if you want weekly emails and newsletters on how to improve in each area of your life, meaning health, wealth, love, and self, then make sure to join the newsletter again from the link in the description. With that said, thank you for being here once again. Thank you for watching, and I'm going to see you in the next one.